Pastor Chris here bringing the teaching for this week. And before I do that, I want to remind us of our book of the month. It's that Relational Christianity book by Steve Meeks. An excellent read, super easy to get through, and just really fills the heart. So take advantage of the extra social distancing moments you've got and get one of these and crack it open. All right. I want to thank you all for tuning in this week. Again, we recognize this is a little different, and we're doing the best we can to stay connected and growing together. And this is one of the ways you're doing it. So I want to give you the cyber hug again this week. Love you, miss you all, wish you were here. But we'll take those while we can get them. And then just remind you to take advantage of the technology. Share the videos and links with other folks. Pause and take screenshots. Feel free to use those, save it all for later. And then email us at info@rivergate.org and give us any feedback that you'd like on this cyber celebration experience. Today's message is kind of an extension of last week. We were talking about dropping the faith bomb in the middle of challenging situations. So where fear and anger are taking center stage, how do we drop the bomb of our faith? How do we bring our faith into the situation in a very helpful, healthy, and effective way? And we did say that we had to, if we were going to drop the F-bomb, we had to build it first, right? And we said that we built that three ways. First was know your God. The second one was find peace in the process. And then the last one was rehearse the truth. That if we'll know our God, find peace in the process, and rehearse the truth, we'll build the kind of faith that becomes effective when we drop it into a situation where there's fear and even anger around difficult situations, such as the one we find ourselves in now. This week, we're going to look at 4 people, one from each one of the gospel books that Jesus met along his journey, who had the kind of faith that he thought should be celebrated, the kind of faith that captured heaven's attention. And if we'll do this, if we'll look at their examples and kind of see who they were and how they rolled in their faith, then we will learn what kind of faith it is that captures God's eye, and then use that to give us insight and to form and to shape our own trust in God. So let's dig right in, shall we? The first example that I want to chat with you about is the Roman Centurion in Matthew 8, 6-13. And I'm going to actually read that story here, and you'll see it pop up on your screen. So it's Matthew 8, 6-13. Lord, he said, I have a son who is lying in my home, paralyzed and suffering terribly. Jesus responded, I'll go with you and heal him. But the Roman officer interjected, Lord, who am I to have you come into my house? I understand your authority. For I too am a man who walks under authority and have authority over soldiers who serve under me. I can tell one to go and he'll go, another to come and he'll come. I order my servants and they'll do whatever I ask. So I know that all you need to do is to stand here and command healing over my son, and he will be instantly healed. Jesus was astonished when he heard this and said to those who were following him, he has greater faith than anyone I've encountered in Israel. Listen to what I'm about to tell you. Multitudes of non-Jewish people will stream from the east and the west to enter into the banqueting feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the heavenly kingdom. But many Israelites, born to be heirs of the kingdom, will be turned away and banished into the darkness, where there will be bitter weeping and unbearable anguish. Then Jesus turned to the Roman officer and said, Go home. All that you have believed for will be done for you. And his son was healed at that very moment. Wow, what a beautiful, beautiful story, right? So I'm going to share, as with each one of these, I'm going to share a hurdle to overcome, a nugget about the quality of faith, and then something that's praiseworthy. And then we'll just share little tidbits from those that deal with those scriptures. So the first hurdle to overcome, to notice here, is unworthiness. Unworthiness. The quality of faith that we want to draw attention to is understanding authority. So there's overcoming unworthiness and understanding authority. And then what was praiseworthy specifically about this expression of faith? It says that he didn't let his past keep him from digging into the promise. He didn't let who he was, where he came from, his background, keep him from digging into the promise of God. So here are some nuggets from that. First of all, the strength of certain godly perspectives can override the weaknesses of others. And here's what I mean by that. There was a strength this man had in his understanding of authority. He knew what it meant to exercise authority, to possess authority, to function in authority, to speak in the name of another, and to know that what you were saying carried weight because of the position that you held, because of who you were. He knew these things, and even though there was an element of weakness in his faith, in that he said, I'm not even worthy, because that's a self-focused idea. Worthiness is a self-focused idea. In that regard, he didn't quite have the right view of Jesus. He didn't quite understand who he was approaching. But can't we all admit that there's a degree to which we're all still learning, right, and growing in our understanding of who God is and how we approach him? But sometimes if we're really strong in a certain area, our faith can rise up through that strength, through that particular perspective, and give us access to things that other elements of our perspective would keep us from. So this man, even though there was this unworthiness that was an ungodly belief, even though he had this unworthiness aspect, he had such a strong sense and understanding of authority that it overrode that element. And I would say that for each of us, we can also kind of look to that for ourselves and say, Lord, there are some ways that my faith needs to grow up, but here are some ways that I really have a strong trust in you. Here are some things about me and some perspectives that I have that are really in line with who you are and the way you work. And so let me capitalize on those until the rest of my perspectives catch up. Amen? Our spiritual inheritance is only as valuable as our alignment with it. All right, it's really important to know that the people that Jesus kind of rebukes in here a little bit and challenges a little bit are the ones that grew up in the faith. He says, look, you've got all these Israelites who have grown up around the promises, knowing the promises, and the promises have been reserved for them. And we'll see that in other examples coming later. But we hear this, Jesus is saying this. He says, but I need you to understand that just because you were born into that doesn't mean you're going to be able to benefit from it. That benefiting from that relationship with God and those promises is not something that's just given to you as a birthright. You have to also steward that birthright and make the most of it. And if we align ourselves with the spiritual inheritance we have, then man, it propels us forward in very powerful ways. We saw that in Paul's life, right? But having good spiritual DNA alone doesn't compensate for unbelief or rebellion. Having a head start in the race doesn't mean that you're going to win it. Right? All right, so one of the things to notice too about this kind of faith is that it gets immediate results. So what's our takeaway from this first example, this first guy? Well, the Roman Centurion shows us the kind of faith that gets heaven's attention is faith that overcomes feeling unworthy, faith that understands authority, and faith that doesn't let the past limit access to the promises of God. Amen? Faith that overcomes feeling unworthy, understands authority, and doesn't let the past limit access to the promises of God. That's the kind of faith that gets heaven's attention, and that's the kind of faith you and I want to have. Amen? All right, so let's take a look at our next example. We're going to look at the Syrophoenician woman. This is found in Mark 7, 24 to 29. It says, Jesus set out from there to go into the non-Jewish region of Tyre. He intended to slip into a house unnoticed, but people found out he was there. But when a woman whose daughter had a demon spirit heard he was there, she came and threw herself down at his feet. She was not Jewish, but a foreigner, born in the part of Syria known as Phoenicia. She begged him repeatedly to cast the demon out of her daughter. Finally, he said to her, "First, let my children be fed and satisfied. For it isn't fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." She answered, "How true that is, Lord. But even puppies under the family table are allowed to eat the little children's crumbs." Then Jesus said to her, "That's a good reply. Now, because you said this, you may go. The demon has permanently left your daughter." Wow. This is one of those examples that, man, just messes with folks, right? Look at the way he responds. And what's the hurdle to overcome for her? If it isn't obvious to you, this one sticks out at me. It is offense. Jesus says something to her that could be really offensive. Could you imagine going to a church somewhere and a pastor saying this? Could you imagine talking to a believer on the road and then someone just sharing this kind of blunt reply to you? But the quality of her faith then is revealed in the fact that she is persistent. So the hurdle she had to overcome was offense, and the quality of her faith is persistence. What's praiseworthy about this? One of the things specifically that's praiseworthy is that she knew that just a little of God's power is sufficient. Just the crumbs, just a little of God's power is sufficient. So she overcomes the hurdle of offense. She persists, and that reveals the quality of her faith. And then this praiseworthy note where she just knew a little of God's power is enough. Jesus intended to go to non-Jewish regions. I think it's important for us to notice that. I believe this woman understood his agenda to that degree. Her persistence was empowered by the trust in the fact that she already knew Jesus intended to bless all people. There was something about the predisposition of her faith because she knew God. She knew Jesus enough to know, hey, he's coming to this region on purpose, and so I'm going to trust that he's not coming just to let us down. He's not coming to tease us with blessings, but he's coming to bring the truth to us as well. One of the other things I noticed too, she said she throws herself down. And I want to just imagine for a moment, if you imagine with me, that this is more than just a moment of humility. I do believe there's something genuine to that. She just humbly throws herself down at his feet. But if you would, understand this within that realm there, that as he's traveling through these regions, there were Jews that were traveling with him. And of course, the Jews of those regions would come and gather to hear him, some to hear and criticize and condemn and to kind of police what he was saying. Others were coming out of curiosity, and still others for genuine hunger, spiritual hunger. But it's important to recognize that she was both a foreigner and a woman approaching a Jewish rabbi. So when she throws herself down at his feet, she knows no one's going to touch her. No one's going to drag her off. No one wants to make themselves unclean in that moment. And I almost picture that she throws herself down half in humility and half in almost like using the tactics of protesters. She throws herself down there like, hey, I'm here to stay, and I'm staying here until my need is met. Like a sit-in. She drops like a sack of potatoes, and you'll have to drag me away. And touch me and drag me away if you're going to get me out of Jesus' presence. So I kind of love that. And then also, she begs repeatedly. It says, and won't allow an offensive comment or even the technicality of a dispensation keep her daughter from being set free. Jesus didn't say, I didn't come for you. He said, I came first for the children of Israel. In other words, there is a propriety to the dispensation of his revelation that he was coming first. He was giving the children of God, the Jews, the first chance to recognize their Messiah. And that was something that was prophesied, and it was something that was appropriate. God was showing, it's always been about family, and he's showing the family nature of this thing. But this woman says that she repeatedly asks him, and she doesn't let this offensive comment. She doesn't take the bait of offense. She just looks past that and says, I see to your heart, and I believe you want to bless me anyway. You're here for a reason, and I'm coming after that. Notice how this kind of faith gets permanent results. We mentioned the last time it was this immediate result, and this one here gets permanent results. The word specifically says in there, in this particular translation, Jesus said that from that moment, the Spirit permanently had to leave her daughter. And I love that. I think sometimes we get challenged in our healings, and the enemy tries to come back on that, and we can stand on a word. With this kind of faith, we can stand on a word and say, no, this is permanent. God's blessing is being secured in my life. So I love that. Well, what's the takeaway from this one here? The kind of faith that gets heaven's attention in this particular instance is faith that is not given to offense, faith that doesn't give up, and faith that knows that just a touch from God is more than enough. That's the kind of faith that gets heaven's attention. It is not given to offense, it doesn't give up, and it knows that just a touch from God is more than enough. How precious. Okay, the next one that I want to draw our attention to is the woman with a blood disorder, or sometimes called the woman with an issue of blood. Luke 8:43-48 says this, in the crowd that day was a woman who had suffered greatly for 12 years from slow bleeding. Even though she had spent all that she had on healers, she was still suffering. Pressing in through the crowd, she came up behind Jesus and touched the tassel of his prayer shawl. Instantly, her bleeding was stopped and she was healed. Jesus suddenly stopped and said to his disciples, Someone touched me. Who is it? While they all denied it, Peter pointed out, Master, everyone is touching you, trying to get close to you. The crowds are so thick, we can't walk through all these people without being jostled. Jesus replied, yes, but I felt power surge through me. Someone touched me to be healed, and they received their healing. When the woman realized she couldn't hide any longer, she came and fell trembling at Jesus' feet. Before the entire crowd, she declared, I was desperate to touch you, Jesus, for I knew if I could just touch even the fringe of your robe, I would be healed. Jesus responded, beloved daughter, your faith in me has released your healing. You may go with my peace. Oh man, so many cool, wonderful, powerful things in here. Okay, first, so let's talk about a couple of hurdles to overcome. I saw two very powerful hurdles that this woman had to overcome. First one was cultural shame, and the second, chronic suffering. We'll talk a little bit about those in a minute, and the quality of her faith, I boiled down to one word, and it was focus. Her faith was focused. She overcame the hurdles of cultural shame and chronic suffering, and she was able to focus her faith in on Jesus. There was one thing touching him. What was praiseworthy about this too? There's another element that I saw in here. She didn't need direct attention or any explanation to believe for her healing. An encounter with Jesus was enough, and Jesus celebrated her subtlety. He celebrated that. He took time out. I mean, someone just grazed him. It was a touch. He didn't even identify it in his natural person. He didn't identify who that was. He said, no, somebody specifically touched me. There was people all around. He was trying to dial in on her. And he honored that. He celebrated that subtle touch. And he drew attention to it. Beautiful. So she overcame the hurdles of cultural shame and chronic suffering. She focused her faith. And then she didn't need direct attention or explanation to believe for that healing. The encounter with Jesus was enough, and Jesus celebrated that. So a couple of nuggets. It was unlawful for this woman to be in contact with other people for fear of contagions. And it was more than just a medical protocol at this point. This had become a cultural stigma. So people suffering from various diseases were considered unclean. In the law, this was actually a medical provision at a time when people's understanding of biochemistry and biological hazards was almost non-existent. God had provided ways for them to bring some safety and some health precautions into their environment, into their community. Well, this had gone way beyond that. This was beyond just laws for purification and for cleanliness. This had become a cultural stigma. So this woman had to actually press past that cultural stigma, press past that issue to contact Jesus, to have an encounter with him, and to get her healing. And there's something very powerful about that. Also, too, the crowd element is really interesting in this one. Not only does that mean there's more of that cultural stigma for her to just grind through and get past, but it's also that her faith wasn't distracted by just the confusion, the noise of the moment, the physical, overwhelming, physicality of the moment. She went past all that to come into contact with Jesus. I also love the fact that it was so impressive that she could actually believe that a guy touching her, or that touching a guy, just touching him, just touching his clothes would be the thing that would heal her. Here was a woman who had spent her fortune for 12 years on the best that medicine could buy, and nothing even touched this thing. Nothing had the results. All of the things that made logical sense for her were ineffective, and she was able to just convert all that faith in medicine straight into Messiah. And that's so impressive. We love the medical community. I've got no problems. I mean, we've got doctors and nurses who are friends and family, and we so appreciate what medicine can do. But we also recognize that there are things Messiah can do that medicine can't touch. And this woman was able to get her faith wrapped around Messiah, and that's so beautiful. She didn't need to have the healing or the sickness explained to her, and this is to her credit. Sometimes we can get bogged down in the details. Sometimes we're only willing to believe what we can fully understand. Now, understanding isn't the enemy, mind you, but it is also not the basis for our faith. Let's put it this way. If our brains are what we're relying on in order to commit to belief, it will cause us delays at best, and at worst, it can be very damaging, even dangerous. It is fine to seek God for understanding. It's even biblical to seek understanding and to have an honor for wisdom and even knowledge. But we cannot let intellect dictate our intimacy with God. We can't let our smarts limit our surrender to the person of God. This woman was happy to remain hidden and just go away with her healing. No explanation needed. But I will also say this, Jesus always desires intimacy with him and intimate connection with those who put their trust in him. It wasn't okay with him for the virtue just to go out. She didn't need to pay for it. She didn't need to make some kind of compensation for it. Jesus wanted to know the person who had the faith to touch him and see the healing come. He wanted to have a relationship with that person. You know, we've heard this before in the past that, people can be very offended when they feel like God is being considered a vending machine. You put a few coins in and just get your stuff out. That name it and claim it, element where it takes the person of God and the relationship with God kind of and sidelines that and just makes it all about the thing itself. And I echo that, the heartbeat for that. Sometimes, though, desperation has us fixed on the problem itself rather than the person of God. But God understands that. He's not afraid of that. But he is going to call us into relationship. So we may get the blessing. Absolutely. That power can be released by faith. But he also wants to then turn around, dial in, and get eye to eye, face to face, and say, hey, let's get to know each other. Let's get to know each other. Really, really precious. While her faith is applaudable, an encounter with God is designed to do more than just release power. Jesus wants to build relationship and impart the truth of acceptance. One of the things that I really dialed in on here is that when he does finally get face to face with her, listen to how he starts the sentence with her. He says, beloved daughter, beloved daughter. There's a special lesson in that. Jesus didn't, call her out to rebuke her. Jesus wasn't trying to get glory for himself. He was looking to connect, and he wanted her to know that this connection was real. She didn't just come and get a blessing and go her own way. She was brought into something. The special lesson is this: we've got to move beyond favor into friendship and family. Jesus says, yes, you had the favor. You have my favor on you, and my favor released. Your faith tapped into my favor, and it released a miracle. But I want you to travel through that favor, go beyond that favor, come through that favor into this place of intimacy. And I want us to know each other and be known by each other as friends and family. So precious. So notice how this kind of faith comes with an instant result and a bonus of peace. He sent her away. Be at peace. He sent her away with peace and this upgrade of family. So beautiful. So what kind of faith is this? This is the kind of faith that gets God's attention, gets heaven's attention, because it presses beyond cultural shame and chronic struggles. It focuses on the person of God and doesn't need explanation in order to trust. The kind of faith that gets heaven's attention presses beyond cultural shame and chronic struggles. It focuses on the person of God, and it doesn't need explanation in order to trust. How beautiful. Okay, so our last example is the nobleman's son. And this is from John 4:46-53. Jesus entered the village of Cana of Galilee, where he had transformed water into wine. And there was a governmental official in Capernaum who had a son who was very sick and dying. When he heard that Jesus had left Judea and was staying in Cana of Galilee, he decided to make the journey to Cana. When he found Jesus, he begged him, "You must come with me to Capernaum and heal my son." So Jesus said to him, "You never believe unless you see signs and wonders." But the man continued to plead, "You have come to me. You have to come with me to Capernaum before my little boy dies." Then Jesus looked him in the eyes and said, "Go back home now. I promise you, your son will live and not die." The man believed in his heart the words of Jesus and set off for home. When he was still a distance from Capernaum, his servants met him on the road and told him the good news. "Your son is healed. He's alive." Overjoyed, the father asked his servants, "When did my son begin to recover?" "Yesterday," they said, "at 1 PM. All at once his fever broke, and now he's well. Then the father realized that it was at that very same hour that Jesus spoke the words to him, "Your son will live and not die." So from that day forward, the man and all his family and servants believed. So good, so good, so good. All right, so what are some hurdles to overcome? I mentioned three. I saw three specific ones in this one. The first one is, and there's 3 Ds, okay? So dignity, desperation, and distance. The hurdles to overcome for this man were dignity, desperation, and distance. The quality of his faith was in humility. He endured a rebuke and kept pressing in. So he overcame the hurdles of dignity, desperation, and distance. And the quality of his faith was found in its humility and enduring rebuke. And what I noticed about this that was especially praiseworthy was that he was willing to meet God on his terms and turf, rather than calling God, to his own spot, rather than calling out for Jesus and saying, "Come to me." He went and searched after God. He met God on his terms and turf. And this was another one of those offendable moments. He could have been offended, but he didn't. He chose not to be offended, but kept pressing in. So here are some nuggets about this one. All of our examples so far have demonstrated humility, but I think this one a little more so. And here's why I say that. This man was a nobleman, so the station he held within his culture was one of honor. So not only did he humble himself by traveling the distance to go there, and although it was only about 20 miles, he traveled that distance, and it was the next day when he was actually making his way back. So apparently the road, to this pathway here had some hurdles, some natural things to overcome. This was no easy jaunt. You and I might be able to take a 20-mile journey by foot in about 8 to 10 hours, but we're traveling on paved roads, and we've got the best conditions to do that. Here was a person in ancient Israel traveling that distance. So he humbled himself, and he took off and traveled this distance to go, meet with the man of God, to go meet with God and have this encounter and seek the Lord for his help and his healing. So there's something to be said about the humility of that. He didn't wait for Jesus to come through town. He could have just waited until Jesus' itineration brought him through town and then invited him into his home and hosted him in this very typical way, which might have culturally been a little more acceptable and understanding. But he literally took off and went after him. I love that. Jesus speaks out kind of a harsh rebuke about sensationalist seeking. And I would say, that there are a lot of folks who will kind of judge judge others for experiential Christianity. Of course, we would say that we believe that there is no other Christianity than that which we fully experience. It doesn't mean that we are just knocked around by every experience that we have. Experiential Christianity means that we expect a relationship with God. We expect our faith and our belief in Jesus Christ to be more than just mental assent, more than just believing a set of facts, but it's about engaging God, encountering God. God is not just a real thought. He's a real person to be known and experienced. And also sensations and feelings. If we run our relationship by our feelings, we can get ourselves in some trouble because our feelings can vacillate back and forth with our experiences. But if we expect to conduct our relationship devoid of feeling, or that feeling is somehow an inferior element within our experience with God, we're missing out on a whole lot. Jesus said very plainly, we're to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. That means every part of us, our mind, our will, our emotions, our spirit man, our inner core, and our physical body are all supposed to experience God in his fullness. So this but Jesus does highlight, he brings out the point that when we are seeking God simply for the sensation of it, we saw this with Herod. Herod was like, perform a miracle for me. Let me wind up the monkey Messiah and see if I can set him loose and see if he'll perform some miracles for me. He wasn't seeking the Lord. He wasn't looking to build his faith. He wasn't seeking to see the nature and identity of Christ confirmed. What he was doing in that moment was just looking for a show, an entertainment. And Jesus is warning about that here. And he kind of calls the man forth on this and said, did you come all this way just for looking for a sign and a wonder? And that man is undaunted. He comes right back and he qualifies that his motivation is desperate. He's motivated out of a desperation to see his son healed. And what more could motivate us, right? Our kids are powerful motivators for us. We want the best for them. We want them to flourish. We want them to flourish. And so this man gets even demanding in the moment and puts it before Jesus. I'm calling out to you. I didn't come here just to see a sign and a wonder. I came here because my son needs healing or he's going to die. And his demand, his outburst doesn't turn Jesus off. Jesus isn't offended by the man's outburst. His outburst is based in faith, and it's laced with a desperation of need and the emotion of his need. And the emotion of his need was probably fear. And that didn't turn Jesus off either. He had enough faith to come. So even if it was only 51% of him was faith and 49 was fear, misplaced faith, right? 49% was fear. He still overcame that, and he brought himself to Jesus for the need. The man's faith was incomplete, right? It was still rewarded though. And I think sometimes we think our faith has to be so perfect, so full, so big in order to see the reward of God. But this man shows us, no, that's not the kind of faith that gets God's attention. If that faith is in you, then yes, of course it'll get God's attention, but God isn't making that a prerequisite for his attention. Your faith doesn't have to be finished. He's the author and finisher of our faith. He's finishing it as we go. Life is a journey, folks, not just a destination. It's a journey. And God is not offended by that. He rewards this man's incomplete and imperfect faith. And I say that too, that even look, that it's only after hearing from his servants the next day, when he hears from his servants about the time and the hour of the healing of his son, that he says, yes, it really happened, and let's give ourselves over to this Messiah. That's when the commitment to surrender his life to Messiah really kicks in, is when he hears the evidence from the servants that came. So I'll say it this way: faith can be stirred up by a request to God, but it is matured through a relationship with God. So faith can be stirred for a request to God, but it is matured for a relationship with God. Notice how this kind of faith comes with instant results. It says instantly his son was healed, and it releases joy, and it releases more faith. So this is the kind of faith that gets heaven's attention. The kind of faith that gets heaven's attention disregards personal dignity, desperation, and distance. This kind of faith humbles itself when rebuked and ventures out to meet God on his terms and turf. The kind of faith that gets heaven's attention is the kind of faith that disregards personal dignity, desperation, and distance, humbles itself when rebuked, and ventures out to meet God on his terms and turf. Okay, so those are our 4 examples. Let's walk it out. So how do we convert this into something we put our hands to even this week in our personal devotions and our time with God? I'm going to say 3 things that you can do. First, review the 4 slides that show the kind of faith that gets heaven's attention. If you rewind, you can actually see those slides. You can pause, take a screenshot, do whatever you need to do to get those 4 slides that showed the kind of faith that gets heaven's attention. Meditate on those, chew on them, think about them. Ask Holy Spirit to help you dial in on that kind of faith. That's the kind of faith that God celebrates. And then take your biggest prayer request, something that would take a miracle, and bring it to Jesus with your upgraded faith. Review the 4 slides, ask Holy Spirit to help you dial in on that kind of faith, and then take your biggest prayer request and bring it to Jesus with your upgraded faith. All right, so that's it for me. Now, Pastor Blaine is going to close us out in prayer, and I do hope to see you again soon.